Thank you very much. And thank you to all for joining us for what promises to be a rich and informative conversation about civic responsibility and the possibilities for strengthening the stewardship of American democracy. I'm Marta Tienda, and I have the privilege of serving as president of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. Like everyone on the call, I am very much looking forward to today's panel discussion. We'll be hearing from 5 distinguished scholars who were awarded fellowships in the American Academy of Political and Social Science in 2021 in recognition of their outstanding contributions to scientific and scholarly understanding of contemporary social problems and the attendant policy implications. That today's panel discussion is virtual is but one sign of the disruption our nation currently confronts. The pandemic continues to consume our bandwidth, challenge our work lives, and rearrange our personal lives. This monumental disruption has occurred against the backdrop of renewed attention to some of the legacies of racism in America, a deepening political and partisan divide that extends far beyond the Beltway, and persistent social and economic inequalities that dampen opportunities for social integration and economic mobility. Even the most dispassionate among us have compelling reasons to be concerned about the myriad challenges facing our democracy, and I'm delighted that the American Academy of Political and Social Science convened this stellar group of scholars from across academic disciplines to discuss these pressing matters and to identify ways to repair and bolster American democracy. It is my pleasure to introduce today's panelists in alphabetical order. Carol Anderson is a renowned historian at Emory University who uses race and social justice lenses to understand the effectiveness of public policies. Professor Anderson has become a prominent public intellectual on voting rights in America precisely because she's done the hard work of detailing our past ways that shed fresh light on contemporary challenges, as in her prescient 2018 book about voter suppression. Jacob Hacker of Yale University is an influential political scientist whose scholarship offers authoritative assessments of how economic inequality undermines the performance of American democracy. Leveraging his deep expertise on healthcare and the functioning of democratic institutions, Professor Hacker uses his voice to advance concrete solutions that address the causes and consequences of economic insecurity, particularly unequal access to quality healthcare. Rucker Johnson is a leading labor economist at the University of California, Berkeley, who uses rigorous empirical methods and multidisciplinary perspectives to expose the causes of poverty, to explore and explain its pernicious consequences for educational outcomes and long-term well-being, and to develop evidence-grounded remedies. Professor Johnson's capacity to explain complex statistical findings with clarity both distinguishes scholarship and confer authority, his voice in education policy circles. Mary Patillo, a prominent urban sociologist at Northwestern University, has made groundbreaking contributions to our understanding of working class and middle class African Americans. As an expert in Chicago's history, politics, and social life, Professor Patillo adeptly deploys qualitative methods to identify the economic forces and the spatial arrangements that constrained economic opportunities for Black families, and in more recent scholarship, how Black professionals contribute to inequality. Catherine Sinkink of Harvard University is one of the world's foremost experts on human rights policy, international norms, and transnational justice. Professor Sinkink's research is an essential read for those who wish to understand how national and international law both helps and hinders the advancement of human rights. Her recent book, Evidence for Hope, is a much needed antidote in an age of anxiety and pessimism. And with that, it's my pleasure to transfer the virtual mic to the moderator of today's discussion, Nick Lemann, a distinguished journalist and author who previously served as Dean of Columbia University School of Journalism, and who also is a fellow of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. Thank you, Nick, for taking time to shepherd what promises to be a richly textured and provocative conversation. Nick, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Marta, and welcome everybody. So the way this is going to go is I will ask each of our panelists in the same alphabetical order an opening question, and they'll answer the question. I don't promise I won't ask a follow-up opening question. So we'll go around the whole panel that way. And what I'm striving for is a lively and fluid discussion. So any panelist who wants to interrupt, or not interrupt, but politely intervene after something another panelist said, please do. Don't wait for the ball to come back to me, so to speak. And you know, I'd like this just to feel like a great dinner table conversation among an unusually interesting group of people. So I'll start by noting that in the subtitle of this event is the word repair applied to democracy. So that implies that everything isn't just fine with American democracy and it needs repair. So I want to, start by asking all of you individually in slightly different ways to talk about aspects of our democracy that need repair and what kind of repair they might need. And I'll stay in the same alphabetical order. So Carol, I'll start with you and ask you to talk about voting, unless you want to highlight some other thing that needs repair even more.
I'm going to start with voting because that is so bedrock foundational to American democracy. And what we see is this assault on the right to vote. It has been ongoing. It is this nation's history. And then we had this brief interregnum after the Civil Rights Act the Voting Rights Act of 1965, where you in fact put federal power behind recognizing that these are American citizens, not just citizens of Mississippi or citizens of Georgia or Alabama, where that state could define and contain and control the basic right to vote. But then we've had these consistent assaults against this right to vote that in fact led us to Shelby County v. Holder, where the US Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. And then we had this ongoing lie of massive rampant voter fraud that was identified, that was centralized towards people who live in the cities, which we can't come to understand as being minorities. So these minorities are stealing American democracy from good, honest, hardworking white Americans. I mean, that becomes the subtext that led to the insurrection. So when you have a Newt Gingrich who says, they're stealing the election in Philadelphia, they're stealing the election in Atlanta, they're stealing the election in Milwaukee, what he's saying is that minorities had the doggone audacity to vote. And they had the audacity to choose not to vote for an avowed white nationalist. And so therefore this election is illegal. And then based on that lie, the big lie, you see this wave of voter suppression laws coming through state after state after state, figuring out how to stop Black folks, Indigenous folks, Asian Americans, Hispanics, poor folk from voting. And if they jump through all of those hurdles, then how to create the kind of system that can lower the guardrails of democracy that prevented the Trump regime from being able to overturn the election in these key electorally rich college states. So that's where we are. We are in trouble.
Would you like to reflect a little bit, we'll return to this, on what people who are concerned about this should think about as the next step to reverse the trend?
Yes, I mean, so what we really need to have is real federal legislation that can override the work that these states are doing. Because you have where they're willing to rig the election. They're willing to have the folks in power. What did Trump say? It was like, it doesn't matter who votes. All that matters is who counts the votes. And so when you have people running as Secretary of State who were signing off on the big lie, when you have local election boards being taken over. So the work requires pushing for federal legislation. The work also requires not getting so cynical that you think that this can't be beat. It requires really coming out in mass and putting enormous pressure on our representatives to do the work, the heavy lifting of democracy.
Great, thank you. And Jacob, I'm going to go to you next and ask about a different sort of basic building block of democracy, which is political parties.
Yeah, so first of all, I'm so pleased to be here with this amazing group of scholars, and thank you, Nick, for moderating this panel. I also want to say that the fellowship that I received is in the name of Robert Dahl, who was a scholar at Yale, whom I greatly admired and got to know. He passed away quite a few years ago, but he was here when I arrived at Yale, and we talked a lot about democracy. And Dahl wrote a book about 20 years ago entitled "How Democratic is the American Constitution?" And his answer was not so democratic. There are a bunch of ways in which our constitutional structure departs from the principle of political equality. Most obviously, the Senate is based on this, the idea that every state should have two senators. And I just think, what Dahl was worried about then was sort of deviations from equal representation of the sort that I think have animated our democratic reforms, like the ones that Carol was talking about. But today I feel like we're facing a risk that I don't think envisioned, which is our democracy itself is under threat. And there's a very old story there. I mean, you said with parties, it's pretty clear that with the Republican Party, right, it's a party that's become increasingly a white party, right, facing off against a party that is more diverse in a society that's becoming more diverse. And that's a familiar story. It's a story that we saw in the retreat from Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow. But there's another story that my work has kind of illuminated, and I want to put on the table because I think it explains why this longstanding threat of sort of driven by racial backlash has become so intense. And that is, we're living through this era of dramatically increased inequality. And that inequality, I think, in very, very specific way, tears at the foundations of our democracy. And one of the ways that it's changed our democracy is that, and the work of Daniel Ziblatt, a comparative political scientist, really illuminates this, is that conservative parties, like the Republican Party, face this challenge in periods of rising inequality, that they would like to side with the affluent, they'd like to push back against policies that redistribute income, but doing so is increasingly, in a society that's facing rising inequality, not a winning electoral strategy. So you think about the way in which Donald Trump actually took a much more economically populist line about the way in which the Republican Party has come to rely more and more on white working class voters who the polls suggest are not that into the program of tax cuts for the rich and corporations. And so the basic story that I think we need to recognize is that part of what's happened to the Republican Party is that in this era of rising inequality, which is tearing at many pieces of our social fabric, they have a very strong incentive to ramp up these kinds of appeals to sort of white backlash and other themes that basically allow them to gain the support of at least a minority of voters, that with those distortions of our political system, they can get to electoral power, to governing power. And in the process, right, it's unleashed a lot of these efforts to try to undermine our democracy that Carol was talking about. So I think we need to see this as a story about how, sort of America's move towards plutocracy has come together with racial backlash to create a really toxic mix that Paul Pearson, my co-author, and I call plutocratic populism.
So let me ask you a follow-up question, or a sort of double follow-up question. One, as is often pointed out in conservative media, there's a lot of plutocrats in the Democratic Party too. Is the framing that all the plutocrats are Republican and the people are Democratic valid? And second, if you want to restore the Democratic Party against plutocratic populism, what's the way to do it? Which I know is a huge question.
Well, I can say very quickly on the first part, the argument is about plutocratic populism is not that all of those at the very top of the economic ladder are on the right. It's that the Republican Party is aligned with the conservative wing of the plutocracy. So think of the Koch brothers, think of the American Legislative Exchange Council, think of the Chamber of Commerce. And I would say, and this is something that's, the party has become so radicalized, right, that there actually is a lot of defection among the very rich from the Republican Party. But if you look at where the kind of organizational might has been among the moneyed elite over the last generation, it's been very much on this agenda that sometimes called neoliberalism of limited government, cutting taxes, financial deregulation, not supporting labor unions. And those policies have, for the most part, both hurt a lot of the voters who vote for the Republican Party and are not very popular among them. And I would just say that I didn't mention this earlier, and this is going to come up again and again, and Carol already started to talk about it. One of the biggest things that's happened with inequality is that we've seen growing gaps between places, and cities have actually seen this economic rebirth. And so cities are still being used as sort of like this image of minorities, but there's also the case that this rural-urban split is increasingly cleaving the parties. And so one of the big things Republicans have done is really appealed to those who live outside of metro areas, saying that this inequality is a result of, whatever, you name your evil, but not plutocratic capitalism. So on the second point, I'll just say that I think there's no way that the Democratic Party can become an effective voice for reform if it doesn't combine a multiracial coalition that is focused on working class Americans. And we can talk more about what that means, but numerically speaking, given the way political power is distributed in the United States, that's going to mean that the party needs to continue to attract working class whites alongside working class Blacks, working class Hispanics, working class Asians, and those more affluent voters of all races who are really disgusted by what has happened within the GOP.
Thanks. And now I'm going to go to Rucker and ask you, well, let me say first, since you mentioned Dahl's book on the Constitution, the Constitution, and we were talking about political parties, the Constitution doesn't say anything, I believe, about political parties. It says nothing or almost nothing about voting. And it also says nothing about education, which is what I want to ask you about, Rucker. So it's noteworthy that in a way where I guess it's, if you want to be optimistic in this pessimistic group, we consider things to be basic to democracy that weren't in the original design of the United States, and we're trying to put them in. Having said that, how do you think the education system is, I guess we can get to this later. I'm not asking you how well it's educating people exactly, Rucker. I'm asking you how well it's playing the part we want it to play as a strengthener of our democracy.
Great. Well, thank you for that. I also want to just first say how delighted I am to be among this wonderful and brilliant set of minds and commitments to these issues. I'm thankful to be able to share some thoughts. I think I draw inspiration from one of my favorite John Dewey quotes, in which he said, democracy has to be reborn in every generation. And education is its midwife. And so what I really want to emphasize here is how and why fulfilling the promise of equal opportunity, and in particular ensuring equitable access to high quality schools, are essential to the health of our democracy. I think we've lost a lot of the public mission of our public schools to prepare future leaders for the multicultural world that they'll inherit, to foster that collective citizenry. And so control of our own destiny can easily be construed, right, as rugged individualism, less public focus, minimal community building and involvement, and limited government. But in fact, control of our destiny requires equitable public investments in education and health beginning at the earliest ages. And so centering education in our efforts to expand civic participation, strengthen our democratic institutions, and build a more inclusive multiracial democracy is central. And I think it's important to highlight that segregation is fundamentally anti-democratic. And it's really the key factor preventing education from being one of the great equalizers of opportunity. And so when we talk about segregation, we're not simply talking about the separation of people, but in fact, the hoarding of opportunity. And it's really the combined aspects of the surges of racial prejudice, the racial intolerance and polarization of political attitudes, the unprecedented economic inequality that Jacob was just emphasizing. Those are not a coincidence, but directly related to and exacerbated by the inequitable distribution of resources across our public schools and their lack of diversity. And here, what I want to kind of first highlight is from its inception, American public education had one of its fundamental tenets, the notion of remedying this inequality of opportunity and being able to be an instrument through which poverty could be reduced across generations. But if you think about like the four broad goals of US public education, the academic, the vocational, the personal, right? It's really overwhelmed the social and civic goals. And so we become too narrowly focused on the private individual returns to education at the expense of the collaborative spirit and public mission and mindset that success is inextricably connected, and our success is dependent on all of our collective success. And so I think it really requires in this moment a recalibration of the vision, the mission, and the goals of our public education systems. And what I mean by this is fundamentally that access to quality schools as a fundamental civil rights issue, and that the victories in the civil rights, whether it's the civil rights movement, they're not such that you win the battle once and it's over. Rather, it's really protecting those rights previously won. And so whether it's resegregation and the rampant gerrymandered school boundaries, or it's gerrymandered electoral boundaries that Carol is speaking of, there are all variants of voter suppression and how they deprive the lifeblood of democracy and opportunity. And so what I think is imperative is that we recognize that we've gone through 3 decades of trying incrementalism instead of transformational change. And I think the standard answers are not addressing the problem. And the siloed approaches have proven woefully inadequate. So I'm trying to emphasize here that education, not just the intergenerational playing field, being able to be a game changer in that way, but actually changing the game itself. That is the metrics we use to measure success at a systems level. And so school systems, in part by the design of the funding systems, often are reproducing inequality rather than ameliorating it. And it's really the quality to education systems and access to them that democratize access to the labor market. So I think those are the pieces that I would have us start, in particular, just the democratizing effects of education, like the whole continuum of youth engagement, instead of being in this place where young people are actually questioning the power of their vote.
Let me ask you as the follow-up, and this is asked partly because I think Mary may want to respond to it too, is, and with apologies for oversimplifying, is the argument for integration in education fundamentally that integration is good in itself, or that if you don't have integration, you're just inevitably going to have separate but unequal in the schools themselves, in their access to resources, in all the network effects of who you go to school with, et cetera?
Yeah, so, I think both and. So I think that both, due to the substantial racial disparities in wealth and the ways that the housing market basically acts as a kind of effectively zoning access to opportunity through the capitalization of school quality through housing prices. And a lot of the parental wealth differences then affect how children are able to access quality schools. And so while I think that one of the pieces that I guess I'm trying to emphasize in this environment is not simply the ability to promote reading and math and those things, which obviously my work has highlighted as critical, but I'm really thinking about schools providing the experiences that distill and instill democratic values, that the knowledge, the skills, the writing, the deliberation, the collaboration, that diversity of perspectives in classroom debates, the critical thinking, the problem solving, right? It's that kind of set of public speaking and those skills that are cultivating leadership skills across difference, right? The proximity to diverse perspectives. And yet when we look at the data, only 9 states and DC require high school students to complete a full year of civics to graduate. So if you want to consider these questions, I think it's important to return civics in the classroom in the right form. And doing that in an integrated school environment, I think is central. Now, if you look at the NAEP, our nation's kind of report card, the National Assessment for Education Progress, you can see that less than 25%, based on the most recent data, and really that's been true the last decade, less than 25% are achieving proficiency on the NAEP civics exam. Yeah. And if, along with the civic test results, the NAEP release also includes information about students' learning experiences in civics classrooms. That is, questions like how often are students partaking in mock trials or political debates and discussions, whether they're giving classroom presentations, or whether they're asked to compare roles and responsibilities of government at the various levels of government, whether they're being asked to consider and examine US relationships with other countries. And the evidence is so clear that most students are rarely, if ever, engaging in 5 of the 7 reported activities. But what's even more interesting is that Black students report some of the highest engagement in these activities in terms of classroom practices. And the rates are slightly higher also for Hispanic students as well, in comparison to white students. So I guess I'm trying to emphasize that I think that there's a mismatch between the problem and the solution, that particularly the timing of intervention is happening earlier, where we can change both hearts and minds and attitudes, whether they be racial attitudes or political attitudes. Those views are much more malleable and in turn influence behaviors in adolescence and in young people's lives. And so I think curricular reform, I think schools have a big role to play. And I don't just mean, I mean from the pre-K environment to the K-12 environment to what we are needing more from our higher education institutions.
Okay.
In this respect.
And Mary, the general topic I want to ask you about is the role of economic arrangements and economic institutions in the ills of American democracy today. But as I said before, you may want to respond directly to Rucker instead or in addition to that. So over to you.
Thanks so much. No, I think when Rucker said both and, that's where we surely agree. I mean, on this, my discussions about integration and segregation is simply how our focus on segregation, and particularly our various kinds of maligning of all Black spaces, whether that be all Black neighborhoods or all Black schools, really undermines our desire to create integration by creating a sense that those are places. Who would want to integrate with the people in those places? Who would want to, have anything to do? So I think that kind of all of the various negative attributions to Black schools, Black neighborhoods is problematic, given the wealth that Rucker just mentioned, given, for example, that Black students are very much engaged in doing kind of political learning in schools, even when those schools are predominantly non-white and predominantly Black or Latino or majority minority, as we might say. But I definitely do want to talk about some of the socioeconomic barriers to full participation. And we can, of course, think about how our kind of narrow idea of when to vote excludes folks who have different work schedules or don't have access to transportation. But I want to talk kind of very specifically about some research that I've been doing along with Alexis Harris at the University of Washington and others across the country on monetary sanctions, which is kind of the part that we don't talk so much about, mass incarceration is one side of the criminal legal system that I think we know a lot about, but monetary sanctions, which are the fines, fees, court costs, surcharges, various kinds of monetary amounts that people are sentenced to pay in traffic, misdemeanor, and felony cases across the country, in courts across the country, state, local, and at the federal level. So just for scale, 6% of adults in the US, 10% of those earning less than $40,000, and 20% of those who have an immediate family member in jail or prison had some kind of unpaid legal debt. This is the national picture. In Illinois, where I am, 98% of all convictions in the past 10 or so years were accompanied by these monetary sanctions, these fines, fees, surcharges, interest if you don't pay. And what these fines and fees do is keep people entangled in the criminal legal system, which keeps them wary of institutions and keeps them disillusioned with ideas of justice and fairness. So I just want to give a quick quote from from our own research. One 62-year-old man that we interviewed here in Illinois was homeless and reported a total monthly income of $192 in food stamps. He estimated that he had been sentenced to pay over $5,000 in court costs, fines, and fees for various felonies and misdemeanors, all of which were drug and traffic related, no violent felonies or misdemeanors. And he said his approach to his monetary sanctions was, quote, "Give Caesar what's due." Why should we pay Caesar? Well, whose face is on the money? Caesar. Then you pay Caesar what's due. So this grandiose sarcasm illustrated this disdain with which he held the criminal legal system, and I would say by extension, the state more generally, the government more generally, more akin to an empire and a despotic regime than a democracy. But alongside, I would say, this more symbolic and cultural pathway, the ways in which these monetary sanctions impede democracy, there's, of course, the direct effect of the criminal legal system on voting rights. In 27 states, people with felony convictions lose their voting rights while they're incarcerated and for significant periods afterwards. And in 10 of those states, their re-enfranchisement is conditioned on paying their monetary sanctions, paying fully their fines, fees, surcharges, restitution, and so on. Florida is the most recent example of this after the voters themselves voted to re-enfranchise people with felony records. The legislature in Florida said that needed to be conditioned on paying all their monetary sanctions, even though the state had very bad accounting of how much people owed so that they could actually get their voting rights back. Sociologist Chris Eugen estimated that 900,000 people in Florida were disenfranchised because they owed outstanding legal financial obligations. So these decisions, of course, fall disproportionately on low-income folks. People with money pay their fines and fees. They're done. They get their voting rights back. They get off probation. They're disentangled from the criminal legal system. So low-income defendants and, of course, Black defendants who are disproportionately in the criminal legal system. There are 7 states where at least 15% of Black people are disenfranchised. So these are the criminal legal system, I think, is important to think about as we talk about exclusion, which I think is a theme throughout what we've been talking about, exclusion. But there are some other EX words that the monetary sanctions part brings up. And that is really about extraction and how this extraction over time keeps people entangled in a system that creates disillusionment, that creates withdrawal from, that creates, again, more exclusion from the mechanisms of democratic society.
Can this problem be solved? At what level of the political system does this problem get solved? Is it national, state, local?
That's a great question. Mostly state level. The federal criminal legal system is much smaller when compared to the state criminal legal system. And so it's really at the state level where laws about fines and fees are made. Also at the local level, many state constitutions have give counties and other jurisdictions the right to impose other kinds of fines and fees. So definitely at the state level. I think the federal level can lead in terms of guidance. And after Ferguson, for example, we saw the federal government, the Civil Rights Division, issuing a report that showed how the many police departments around Ferguson participated in this over-policing, mostly because of revenue generation. And we saw how that led to obviously deadly results in the killing of Michael Brown because of this over-policing of very small infractions. So local systems also matter, and the federal government can do the research and give guidance about how we might think about this at the local level. But I think it's really at the state level where intervention is most important.
Okay. And now, Catherine, I want to go to you. And a lot of your recent work has been about the relationship between rights and responsibilities. And if you're comfortable doing it, I'd like to sort of plug that way of thinking into the broader discussion about the health or ill health of our democracy.
What a privilege to be with this great panel. And I want to pick up really with this wonderful quote that Rucker gave about Dewey's quote about democracy has to be reborn in every generation. But I want to talk about a group we haven't talked about yet, and that is college students. It's a group that we interact with all the time and that vote at one of the lowest levels of any group in the United States. Now, they suffer partly from the kind of voter suppression that we've talked about. But it's a slightly different group because compared to other groups in this country, college students, even not just at private universities where some of us teach, but college students in general, are a relatively privileged group. I work on international human rights. But I was interested in this issue of rights and responsibilities and how responsibilities increasingly became separated from the human rights language. And so I delved into this issue of, because I was surrounded by it, of college student voting. What I discovered was first that and through a series of focus groups, and these include, I know, focus groups at Harvard, which may not be very representative. What I found is Harvard students vote at very low levels. They find voting extremely complicated and difficult. And they often do not think they have a responsibility to vote. And sometimes they even think that they shouldn't vote because our system is so corrupt that it's not worth voting. Okay. And at the same time, I learned that student organizers have made dramatic progress since 2016 in increasing student voting in very important ways. Between the 2014 and 2018 midterms, for example, student voting about doubled. So there is and we believe it, and we're still waiting for the figures to come through on the 2020 elections that take a long time for to generate these very interesting numbers we get about college student voting. But there's an understanding there's been a dramatic increase as well. So what I'm concerned about is this notion that students are very disillusioned, right? They're very disillusioned and they don't think they have a responsibility to vote. And that sometimes when, and what students tell me in focus groups is they don't get support from their professors. For the most part, political scientists, maybe this is changing, but political scientists are not helping their students think about voting. They're not helping their students know how to vote. Cope with the difficulties of voting in a federal system, and they don't. In fact, sometimes political scientists are the ones who encourage their students to think the system is so broken that they shouldn't vote. Okay, and so I think we have to raise an issue here about the care with which we talk about how broken our system is and the need for repair. That we are not creating in the young people who surround us a sense that all is hopeless, and a sense that so students think that their vote doesn't count. therefore why vote? We as political scientists tell them that sometimes their vote doesn't count, they listen. They also, and so the question is, I think, is what can universities do? Because universities need to help their students be able to vote. And some universities have done that. We see there's very, very dramatic differences between student voting in different universities. And it's not just a private-public debate, okay? It's divisions within public institutions, different within community college, within private institutions. So we know that universities can do things and colleges can do things to increase voting. And the most important thing is to create a campus climate where people think that they have responsibility to vote, where voting is the thing to do, it's the cool thing to do, where it's supported by all levels at the institution, including faculty. So while we're considering all these very, very important issues that all the fellow panelists have raised, I want us to not forget the people that we're surrounded with, and that's our students, because that is, as Rutgers said, that is the new generation of democracy that has to be reborn every time.
Thanks. I have tons of questions, but I just wanted to take a moment and say, does anybody on the screen, has anybody heard anything in the foregoing that they'd like to respond to or ask about or anything like that before I jump in? No? Okay. All right. Well, if you feel so moved, then don't hold back. Catherine, I want to come back to you for a moment because I know you've thought about this rights and responsibilities frame with relation to climate change. So could you speak about that a little bit?
Okay. So there's in general with human rights, we think of rights, but there's also corresponding responsibilities. At least in international human rights, we think that the states have responsibilities and individuals have rights. But there's a series of issues, and climate change is a really good example, where we can talk about your right to a clean climate or your right to a stable climate until we're blue in the face. But unless today every actor connected to the structural injustice of climate change and able to act takes action, we're in big trouble. Okay, and so I believe that sometimes we want to stress rights and not always responsibilities, but there's some issues like climate change where that is, we cannot cope with this issue without talking about everyone's responsibilities. COVID is another great example, and just before this panel started, we were having an interesting discussion about the responsibility to wear masks. Right. And again, we have the rights issue flipped, right? We have individuals making arguments they have a right not to wear a mask instead of making arguments about this is a public health issue and we all have responsibilities to deal with this public health issue. So I just want to suggest that at least with regard to my involvement with student voting issues, I think we need to talk about responsibility of students to vote as well. Not just their right. My students think they have a right to vote and a right not to vote. Okay, and I personally have said, actually, you don't have a right not to vote. You have a choice not to vote, right? Knowing that you're not going to be punished for. But we have, of the other civic responsibilities we have, to serve on juries, to pay taxes, etc. You don't have a right not to serve on juries. You don't have a right not to pay taxes. You don't have a right not to register for military service. Why should you all of a sudden have a right not to do the easiest of these civic things and responsibilities? And so I would just like to suggest that responsibility is part of the language that we need to be using along with rights for these important issues.
Go ahead, Carol.
I teach the civil rights movement. And so my students see young folks putting it on the line. And it empowers them. They see what is possible and they engage on campus, they engage with each other. And so part of it is just making really legible the power that they have. And one of the things that I say to them, I was like, you are the largest demographic out there now. You are larger than the baby boomers. If you vote at the percentage or at higher level than the baby boomers, you can transform this system. Never cede your power. Never give up your power. You can deal with environmental injustice. You can deal with student loan debt. You can deal with the housing crisis. You can deal with all of those issues. You can deal with criminal justice reform when you wield your power. Now, what we know in that wielding of the power, I mean, we saw it in North Carolina, where the state drew separated North Carolina A&T between two separate congressional districts. We saw it in Prairie View down in Waller County, Texas, where the city, the town fathers decided that the county, which is overwhelmingly white, would have like weeks of early voting, but Prairie View A&T would only get a few days, and one of those days, the polling station would be off campus, inaccessible. That was when so we know that what these states do, what these government entities do, is that they respond to that power by trying to create these additional hurdles. And so what we have to do is to make clear that those hurdles will be there. But when you put in power folks who recognize that this is a democracy, and that you have the right to speak, you have the right to have real representation, then it becomes a very different kind of narrative that is being put out there. And you see a different kind of engagement because the issues that they care about are there. And to make this salient to them about how you work through this political process, how you work through voting. And so one of the things that we do have to do with the wave of new voter suppression laws that are coming through is to begin to explain to our students what it's going to take to be able to register to vote in these states, what it's going to take to be able to find where your polling place is. How do you use an absentee ballot? When is the time frame that you have to request an absentee ballot, to work through the mechanics, the civic mechanics of voting for our students? That's part of what we must do as educators for this next wave of incredible folks.
In a few minutes, we're going to go to questions that are people who are attending or sending in. And if you're attending, please keep sending them in. I want to take a moment to exercise the privilege of the chair, since I'm a journalist, and ask you, we haven't talked about how the media are doing positively or negatively in the health of American democracy story. So I'd like to, I won't single out anybody, but does anybody feel moved to talk about that piece of the story?
I can just say a few words. There's a lot in my most recent book, Let Them Eat Tweets, about right-wing media. And there's just a huge amount of research that's been done by political scientists. It shows how important right-wing media in general and Fox News in particular have been in changing the way our politics works. And I'll just say something that you mentioned up front, Nick, which is that, you know, our political system, our Constitution was structured around this ideal of nonpartisan politics, even though it was already breaking down at the time the Constitution was founded. And this political system, our political system, does not work very well when there's this sort of hyperpolarization where all the cleavages sort of line up with each other. And one of the reasons why it has become so hyperpolarized and why the right side of the political spectrum has become even more extreme relative to the left, that's, you know, a very basic finding of political scientists, is that we've had this kind of asymmetric polarization. One of the big reasons for that is right-wing media. So I think the right-wing, I think that the broader media world has actually improved a lot since 2016, when it was sort of amplifying a lot of half-truths and falsehoods, but also just sort of setting the agenda of the campaign in a way that was quite favorable to Trump. But that right-wing media has simultaneously become I think a lot more important. And that's partly because it's moved away from Fox News into a broader world of social media. And I was just the other day on a yesterday, actually, doing an event with a scholar, Barbara Walter, who's written this book about how civil wars start. And one of the surprising findings, to me at least, is the extent to which kind of the deep fractionalization that leads to civil wars is highly associated now with social media. Like there, in countries, the demonization of groups and the organization of violence is increasingly coming through social media. And so I think we have to recognize the extent to which both, sort of Fox News and other kinds of more traditional right-wing media and this world of social media, which, by the way, is mostly taking place on a platform that's run by someone who's not a right-winger, right? Facebook, that to the extent to which that's really destabilizing our democratic system and helping feed some of the kind of animus and myths that Carol was talking about earlier, that are part of the voting wars that are taking place at the state level.
So this is a follow-up for Jacob or anybody else, is kind of a version of the question I've been asking, which is what's the solution? I think I'm the only person on this screen who grew up as a white person in the Jim Crow South. And believe me, there was a lot of right-wing media around, but you didn't see it because it was like little mimeograph sheets that my friends' parents would have on their coffee table and stuff like that. And the reason you didn't see it was we had a regulated broadcast system. And then we deregulated, and we thought that would be a great idea. And now look. So, should we re-regulate media? Should we understand social media as essentially publishers, not common characters, common carriers? How should we conceive of this problem?
I'll just say very briefly, because I think this is a theme that's going to come up in our conversation already, that we need to think about structural reforms of our democracy more broadly, as well as the mobilization that Carol was talking about, right? These are both essential parts of the story. And it may well be that there are aspects of what's happened in media that are just not amenable to easy solutions. And therefore, it's much more important to minimize whatever damage occurs. And of course, there's a kind of doom loop that takes place, right? If you have a system that is distorted, say, where this false narrative of a stolen election or a voter fraud is driving changes at the state level, and those state level changes in turn are helping to keep people in power who are feeding that narrative, that's a way in which changing the political system will help diffuse some of the role of right-wing media or distortionary media in general. But I do think we could regulate social media quite simply. The major platforms are American. The fact is that there's no reason, there is actually lots of talk about ways in which we could make it less destructive. And Barbara Walter has a good idea, which is, stop the algorithms that create these kind of self-reinforcing cycles of radicalization. Like that, at the very least, let's address that aspect of social media that actually is amenable to regulatory change.
Others want to comment on this record?
Yeah, I just wanted to interject if I could. I think, we recognize that public engagement and public trust in government are at historic low points. And I think the turning apathy into action requires in understanding the power and the fragility of democracy, when it is really to center student voices, to be omnipresent in the discussions, that when people come together to make a collective difference, there's something about what animates a virtuous cycle of elevated civic participation, like Carol was speaking previously, that if you look at the major things that have sparked social movements, they've been young people, from the civil rights movement to the more contemporary Black Lives Matter, women's rights issues, Me Too. The issue is really about how we have not civic education done to young people, but with young people, so that we can kind of co-construct the democracy we want and realize that young people's ability to see the world from what it can be, being more imaginative with policy solutions, and not just what is, or being prisoners to the status quo, or what the older generation may have considered politically feasible, or what has already existed. And so I really feel the lost contact with the need of that civic engagement, especially in these polarized times. And part of what it makes it harder is to convince lower income minority groups that have been subject to a broken system that voting can be a viable path for change when they are inheriting a system that's already been broken. Now, I think what's connected though to this that I would offer in conversation with what Catherine raised earlier was on the rights issue. There's different, I would suggest that there's different ways freedom can be defined. So that in the US, the choice paradigm is so strong in America that we tend to focus on freedom to speak, freedom to own guns, freedom to choose. That freedom of choice language was used to resist integration itself. And so there's not as much attention to freedom from poverty, freedom from homelessness, injustice, freedom from lack of inadequate medical care, freedom from discrimination, freedom from exposure to violence, freedom from being confined to a poorly functioning education system. And so the emphasis appears on the right to individual choice, even if it infringes on the rights of others to be healthy. We're seeing that in the pandemic, whether it's a public health mission, the mission of our public schools, public safety with gun violence. I think there's this common aspect of things where we have to reconsider how we define liberty in that fundamental way.
Although I guess there's always the risk that people could complete your freedom from sentence in other ways. Freedom from state intervention, freedom from regulation, freedom from the state telling me what to do on my property. Exactly, right. But of course, Rucker, I get your point, but the sentence could be completed in different ways. And I think that's, it is completed that way. That is the kind of rugged individualism, libertarian strain that is also a freedom from strain.
I'm going to go to questions now. So I'm going to just read them out. Here's the first one. I think this is for Rucker, but you guys decide. In our deeply polarized circumstances, how do we go about achieving agreement on curriculum development and content? And just to piggyback onto that, I've noticed, I'm sure you have too, that there's never an end to culture war starters. And the latest is, should parents control schools or should teachers control schools? So Rucker or anybody else who wants to reflect on that.
I'll start. And I think what's important is to consider in this period where we're talking about the importance of engaging with diverse perspectives and having healthy debate. At the same time this is occurring, Tennessee, Texas are making it illegal to teach history. I mean, they're making it illegal to teach an authentic, honest conversation about race. And this ostrich syndrome, what do ostriches do when they sense danger? Right? They bury their heads in the sand. So there's these things about how we move forward is by ensuring that the conversations happen, and whether they're aspects of race or aspects of affirmative action debates, I think our higher education institutions are going to have to lead in a prominent way. And I think some of that means that there's going to have to be a judgment on higher education institutions that are not attending to issues of offering greater socioeconomic mobility. So there's a lot of, evidence now on the detrimental consequences of bans on affirmative action, on racial equity in higher education and beyond. But in contrast, there's no attention given to legacy admissions as affirmative action. And what that means is that in our higher education spaces, the quality of the discourse actually suffers from that lack of diversity. So I think it's critical that we ensure that what feels like risky conversations be embraced as like the only path forward to kind of create that ability to have divergent perspectives be able to be, in some fundamental way, considered against the backdrop of the history that got us to this point. So conversations without that historical underpinning really don't allow the context. And so that's why these laws that are making it illegal to teach history are very dangerous for moving us forward. I know
Anybody
Carol can
else?
speak on this much more eloquently and in her work on this. I guess that's what I would say to start us off.
I mean, I would look at this like back in the old Soviet Union, there was Lukashenko who came up with a scientific theory. And when you have a Lukashenko that is driving this theory of DNA, of genetics, and it doesn't match up with the reality of science, you've got really bad science. And it threw the Soviet Union back decades in terms of what it could do. That's what's happening when you don't teach real history. That is, I mean, so imagine you're in Tennessee that had slavery. You're in Tennessee that had the Memphis riot in 1866. You're in Tennessee that had the founding of the Ku Klux Klan. How do you teach this history without understanding the way that slavery and Jim Crow and racism and violence played in the development of that state? And so what it's designed to do is to flatten the narrative. It is to create a civic propaganda that this is just the flattened greatest nation ever. This democracy came out full born and perfect and with no flaws, and anybody who critiques it is un-American. What you don't get to, though, is that the power of the United States is that this was a nation that has its aspirations and its reality. And it has been that fight to make those aspirations real that is the bedrock foundation of this nation's history. It is the way people fought to make, we hold these truths to be self-evident, to make them self-evident. And these battles that we have about what is America, who is an American, that's our history. When we have it flattened out like this, then you don't understand what makes this nation. Why we fight so hard for this democracy. And why would you steal that from the children?
So Nick, let me jump in really quick on this. And first of all, you wanted disagreement. So Rucker, I am told by folks who are more knowledgeable about ostriches than I that actually that's a slur against ostriches. They actually don't bury their heads in the sand. So we're gonna have to find another case. Apparently, it was developed in Rome, this myth, but we'll stop there.
You're also not
but
supposed
a more
to be...
serious, actual not a disagreement, a question, I think, that relates to one that you asked earlier, Nick, about like, so what's the strategic approach? What happened in Virginia with this, with talking about critical race theory, right, was that you had a group of people who, found the governor, the Republican candidate, appealing because they're angry about the 1691 project. They're angry about what Carol is talking about. But a lot of folks, right, a much larger group that allowed the Youngkin to win, right, thought the schools shouldn't be closed down, that the pandemic had revealed a kind of imperiousness on the part of officials. And that's the nature of the kind of culture wars that as I said earlier, that have become the kind of substitute for a pocketbook appeal to work, to white voters that Republicans have used. And how to diffuse that seems to me a really fundamental issue that folks like us need to think about, because I stir to what Carol said, right? It's like it makes me want to say say all in on this agenda. And yet at the same time, right, there's clearly a backlash that's taking place that has to be dealt with. If for no other reason, then our political system is really tilted against in favor of the folks who are caught up in that backlash. And so I don't know the answer, but to me, I think a lot about this question. And to me, it's one of the hardest ones, because Democrats are in a really deep bind in this coming election. And it seems as if part of the reason for that is that it's possible for these themes of backlash to be used in a way that can actually gain close enough to majority support to be able to create governing power for those who are using these appeals.
I'm going to go to another question that somebody sent in. So it's long-ish, so bear with me. And here it is. What can we learn about salutary changes in civil rights and responsibilities from the post-robber baron era, that is early 20th century, or from the post-war era, mid-20th century, or in the post-civil rights era, late 20th century? When the Piketty book came out, we all know what that is, and in the time just before COVID, there was a lot of reflection from scholars and commentators comparing the current age of inequality to the robber baron era. But that national conversation seemed to emphasize what we learned about dealing with economic inequality, not necessarily positive changes in civics. And so anybody want to respond to that? I mean, I'll respond to that first. You guys probably don't watch right-wing media that much, but as one who feels it's his professional obligation to do so, there's a strain that really deals with what you're calling the post-robber baron era, or we'd also call the progressive era. I'm thinking of Glenn Beck, the guy who was so right-wing that Fox fired him. And he was obsessed with this. And then if you go into more like the conservative justices on the Supreme Court, you get into language around the administrative state, et cetera. So, it's a core idea, is this idea of expertise in government that comes out of the progressive era and administrative law and things like that, which was a kind of establishment centrist liberal alternative to populism 100 years ago, and now is kind of bubbling under the surface of the conservative world as sort of a key talking point. I don't know if anybody else agrees or wants to come in on that. Okay. Should I go to another question?
Well, let me just say on Piketty, I read the Piketty argument to basically be that what ended the massive inequality that went through the early, the Great Depression was our mobilization for war, right? And the upheavals that occurred across the globe in richer countries due to the war. And I think people took Piketty as providing a very pessimistic view of the prospects for democracy to challenge rising inequality. And I guess I would say I'm more optimistic, except for right now, our democracy is in a very bad way, because I think my own thinking is that, in fact, there's a lot of scope for reforms that would improve, that would reduce inequality, but that the real challenge for us, because I think inequality is fundamentally a product of our democratic politics in many ways, but the real challenge for us is figuring out how to get our democracy to work better. So that's substituting one really difficult problem for another, but it's at least a problem that the group here has been talking about. So that would be my quick take.
One other thing I want to throw out that is a feature of the progressive era that doesn't get enough airplay is that at the beginning of the progressive era, women couldn't vote, and at the end of the progressive era, women could vote. And I would offer the hypothesis that changes the political consciousness of the country in a lot of ways.
I actually want to go back to the first question in terms of, so if we're talking about Piketty, what are his proposals for reform? And his proposals are wealth tax, an international wealth tax, which he himself admits is virtually not possible. But a second proposal is something that there has been some movement on, and this is around tax havens, right? And so taxes are an issue that you virtually increasing taxes are like a no starter in American politics, but actually closing down tax havens would be something that that a democratic government could propose that could significantly increase U.S. U.S. ability to collect taxes and to spend it on some of the social programs that we need to decrease inequality. So see, if I were choosing a Democratic Party U.S. route, I would get on, and the OECD has started to move in this direction. I would get on the shut down tax havens bandwagon.
What I find interesting about thinking about this particular moment is how it stops us from thinking about, say, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. So if we think about the fact that over half, just slightly over half now of people under 18 years old, that demographic is now majority minority, meaning the non-white people are now the majority of people under 18 years old. So kind of coupling this with what Rucker's talking about civic education, I think what the consternation that we're feeling right now is this demographic change is, as Jacob says, as Carol has said, it is white people feeling like they have lost something and that people of color have stolen something. But soon the demographics will be very different, and that voice will be much smaller, and the much larger voice will be the young people that Carol and Rucker have been talking and Catherine have been talking about. But I think what's key is we can't just assume that Black, Latinx, and Black, Latino, and Asian American and Native American young people will be left leaning or will, be more progressive. And I think this be more redistributive, be more democratic, any of those things. But I do think that this civics education that Rucker is talking about, this sure desire and passion to be thinking, to be imagining. I mean, that's one of the key components of Black Lives Matter is its imaginative potential, its ability to think about abolition of the police, its ability to think about the eradication of gender binaries. I mean, its imagination, I think, is one of its key capacities. But I think we have to cultivate that imagination through the kinds of educational structures and content that Rucker is talking about. But, we really need to maybe not, I'm not saying we shouldn't be worried about the moment that we're in right now, but the future suggests a very different constituent that we will be talking to, and less about bringing white working class voters on board and more about, what are Native American young people thinking about.
But Mary, part of what I worry about with that is that when I'm seeing the way that these structures are being twisted and contorted, is that it looks like it's to create a neo-apartheid state in order to deal with these changing demographics. Because as we know, in South Africa, you had a large Black majority, and you had a small white minority, and the political power rests in the hands of that small white minority. And so when I heard Trump talking in 2015 and 2016 of make America great again, and you would ask the question to his followers, okay, so when was it great? And they would come back with, well, in 1850, okay, that would be when like slavery was, okay, or 1950, okay, before Brown, when Jim Crow was going strong. And so you see this hearkening back to these moments where political power and economic power was concentrated in the hands of whites, overwhelmingly in the hands of white people. And so I see this contortion. So the move for voter suppression, the move to make it much more difficult for young people to vote, the move to make it much more difficult for poor people to vote. All of that is to be able to, one, concentrate that power in the hands of those whom they deem to be real Americans. It is that creation of this neo-apartheid state. That's what we're fighting so hard to prevent, so that we can get a real democracy and not a hair-invoked democracy.
I just echo both of the points that both Carol and Mary said. I mean, it's really in light of the fact that the population of the nation's public school children has never been more diverse, racially, ethnically, linguistically, and that those trends are going to continue into the foreseeable future. But then it asks and begs the question, how we meet the educational needs of culturally and linguistically diverse students is then paramount. And otherwise, without major reform efforts, increasing numbers of children from lower income minority communities will not obtain the education necessary for full participation in the economic and civic life of the country. So I think part of what I think is also is the difficult tractability of democracy and the quality of its functioning, as well as the difficult tractability of structural racism. Both of those things is that there's no single person or entity or institution responsible for it. And so that definitely challenges how we're able to kind of develop the right interventions to get the kind of sustained change that's requisite to the challenge.
Okay, I have a couple more questions in the queue, and I want to make sure we get to them before we run out of time. This one is a little bit on the longer side, but bear with me. And the second one is on the shorter side. About youth voting. Doesn't the very long-standing low turnout of young voters suggest that a non-voluntaristic solution is required, perhaps for all eligible voters for that matter? In the absence of a federal requirement with modest fines, such as $50, it's another fine for you to think about, Mary. Institutions could make voter registration education a requirement. Side note, I'm an elected official, yet even before I was elected, first in 2017, I would educate my students each fall and spring term about practical voter registration steps. There are at least 2 elections a year, for example. It's easy and takes a few chunks of 5 minutes. One should be nonpartisan about it, offer extra credit, but no reason why institutions couldn't step up to create rules to coordinate this across a campus. Voluntarism has its limits. So responses to that?
Well, I guess I'd like to say, of course, we need structural and institutional reform of the kinds that many have spoken about to here. Okay, but in the meantime, lots of countries have mandatory voting, which is what's being suggested here, right? Much of Latin America that I study has mandatory voting. But for the reasons we just talked about, I just don't think it's going to fly in the United States in our libertarian culture, right? And so the idea that you're going to make mandatory voting and then fine people $50, you can imagine these are people won't even wear masks in this country to protect them from dying. I can't believe they're going to agree to mandatory voting. So I think we need to combine these ongoing efforts around responsibility. I don't think we should denigrate the other responsibility with mere voluntarism, right? We have to say, no, we're going to put together this responsibility, which some of it is individual, with the need for structural and institutional reforms. And there's a lot that can be done. And the fact that student voting is low, but it's increased dramatically. And that's because of changes that students and universities have done. At many universities nowadays, you register for classes and you get a window that helps you register to vote. Why aren't we all doing that? It's simple. It doesn't require students. They don't have to require to vote. They get the option and they get the material they need to register to vote. There's lots of reforms like that are being practiced and could really dramatically increase student turnout, have increased and could increase student vote. But can I just say one thing? What I'm worried about is that we're going to have the fall off again because so many young people are disillusioned. I'm already hearing it. Biden's done nothing. We all went out and voted and he's done nothing. And so there's this notion, and this happened in the second Obama term as well, the disillusionment set in and people stayed away from the polls. And my question is, what's the media doing? But also what are public intellectuals doing to make sure that we're not creating a sense of such disillusionment that young people won't want to vote?
I mean, as one in the media, I feel I can say one of our problems is, Biden's done a lot for somebody who has a very thin, almost non-existent majority in Congress. We love these sports type narratives where, Biden, can he get Build Back Better? That becomes the story. And then we love characters. We have Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema. So it's very, very hard in the media culture for us not to go there rather than let's look at what has actually been accomplished. And obviously, I'm not saying that to say, I love that about the media. But anyway, I hope my students won't do things like that. But
we should all watch the PBS NewsHour.
Well, that's one of those things where it's out there and people have a choice, and a lot of people choose to watch it and a lot more people choose not to watch it. So what are you going to do? I'm going to go directly to the last question, because that way I get to have asked all the questions that I have. And it's a conversation starter. How do we make the case that affirmative action is a win-win for everyone rather than a zero-sum game? And obviously context for that now is the Supreme Court taking these two cases, which I take as a signal that they're going to hand down a big anti-affirmative action decision. Thoughts on that? No? Rucker, you had your hand up.
I was trying to unmute, sorry about that. Yeah, so I mean, I'm at the UC system. We have more lower income students than the rest of the Ivy League put together. No disrespect to Jacob and Catherine. We have, as an institution, the UC system, UCLA, UC Berkeley, have some of the highest socioeconomic mobility rates of any higher education institution. There's a lot of pride that I have in that. But the ban on affirmative action has dramatically affected the racial ethnic diversity, particularly among African American. And I think that while the socioeconomic diversity is an important piece, it's not the same as the racial ethnic diversity that I think really allows the diverse perspectives and life experiences to come through in a way that enriches the entire environment. So one of our PhD students at UC Berkeley, Zach Bleemer, who's now assistant professor at Yale, published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics the first major study documenting the detrimental consequences of bans on affirmative action on racial equity, following the entire universe of those that had applied in the late 90s and followed them up through their adulthood labor market earnings, and really documented systematically how it affects, and in ways that are not uniform across racial and ethnic groups. And so if you look at the other kind of work like by Sandy Black or Jesse Rothstein using the Texas 10%, again, they're documenting that there are efficiency and equity gains through need-based affirmative action that is not coming through simply with kind of merit-based, that's not connecting the socioeconomic diversity focal point. So I think as long as our schools are so segregated leading up to college, and the college readiness gaps be a thing that doesn't allow test scores to fully capture the ability of many racial ethnic minorities growing up in lower income environments, I think we have to wrestle with that straightway. And so I am concerned about affirmative action being under attack, while legacy admissions that are just continuing and reinforcing inequality across generations goes completely untouched. So, I know my panelists have much more to say, so let me be quiet here. Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to say, so all of us here on the call are at elite universities where affirmative action is an issue. At most universities, affirmative action is not an issue. But I do think what's really important in terms of thinking about it as a win-win is the ethos that affirmative action brings to these elite and otherwise exclusionary institutions is a push towards more inclusion. And I think it's only because of discussions around affirmative action that we've also had discussions around increasing socioeconomic diversity, about increasing regional diversity, about increasing international diversity, about increasing diversity of learning styles. I mean, all of those stem from the activism that created affirmative action and the transformation of the idea of affirmative action from redressing past wrongs to a question of diversity, which I think in some ways have been detrimental to the initial hopeful beneficiaries of affirmative action. But if we're thinking about win-win discursive framings, I think this point about, as always, the kind of leading social movement opens the door for many other populations afterwards is really a good way to think about it being a win-win.
Others want to come in on this? Marta, you've come back, so that must mean we're getting near the end.
That is correct. It's been a very rich discussion. I expected nothing less, but it's even been, I have to say, it's been extraordinary. I'd like to pick up and close this, but first by picking up on the last theme that was mentioned on diversity and affirmative action. That word is not used very much in the higher ed literature. It shifted to diversity and inclusion, but I want to put on the table that for the business community, diversity is not a nice to have. It is a must-have. It affects the bottom line, and they are very clear about it. So the diversification of boards, I serve on boards, and it's not just because it's a good thing to do or it's a sign of the times. It's because not to do it incurs real economic costs. So if we can't educate the pipeline and diversify the pipeline that's going to become the leaders, and it's not all at the Ivy League where we are generating the future leaders, then we are going to fall behind as a country. We must leverage, capitalize on our diversity rather than manage it. And I think reframing in those terms is a big step forward. I think this has been an incredible discussion about the importance of restoring faith in our democracy and also trust that's been eroded over this time period. The word came up a couple of times in the discussion, but in the voting of the young people, the disillusionment, and that has to be rekindled in a real fundamental way. There was another big theme was rights and responsibility, going back to Resor, you know, the right to be governed, but it incurred some, you give up some things and you get some things in exchange. The challenges of voter suppression are very real. I see them here in Texas, where applying to vote in absentee ballot has over 50% of the applications have been denied because they registered with their driver's license and initially, and then they're putting in their social security number, and it's no match. So really fundamental things, simple things that have been created as an additional obstacle. So voter suppression, I think, is one of the big challenges for our democracy going forward. Another theme was education as a key institution for realigning our demography with our democracy. We are not going to change the demography of the population. It's been changing over a long period of time, and it's high time that we come to terms with it. But if we can't do it through the education system, then where? If we can't do it now, then when? And that, to me, is one of the big critical pivotal points that we could come to terms with, and whether as educators that we face as a responsibility, but as a society more generally in the K through 12 system, coming to terms with who we are. So the challenges of social media that's fragmented. The AP used to give all the headlines. That's no longer the case. We have a fragmented social media. We pick who we want to believe, and that's how we've handled COVID. That is, you follow those that support what you already believe, and then you act accordingly. That doesn't work for a collective, for a community, for a society. I heard something about the aspirations to reimagine American democracy. And I think that's really the bottom overriding theme, but it can be, we have to broaden that umbrella of who we the people are. And it's a much bigger umbrella, not only because we're 331 million today, but because we are the most diverse nation in the world. As a country, we are the world. And if we can't use that to set the example by using our democratic institutions, then I think we are going to be a much weaker nature. So it's clear, another closing theme is that there is no time for indifference, not to decide, not to act. Just to stand by is to acquiesce. And I think that in that vein, that we have a responsibility through our teaching and through our public service and all of our social networks to actually be active and rather than passive in our democracy. That's what a democracy is. It's participation in exchange for certain benefits and protections. So I want to thank everyone for participating today. I want to congratulate all the new fellows and our newest cohort, extraordinary choices. We're so lucky that you are in our fold and our family, and thank you all for attending. And to Tom for his diligence in organizing, and Emily and the whole team at the American Academy of Political and Social Science for organizing this event. It is a labor of love. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Thanks to everybody, and congratulations.